I'm going to give you some tips on how to incorporate women, and especially powerful women, into your medieval Europe-style fantasy while still being as historically correct as possible. I know some people who want a degree of historical accuracy in their medieval-type fantasy struggle to include women in their stories. We all know that women in medieval Europe didn't really do anything. They didn't have any power, and their role was to get married off and take care of the household while their husband did all the important things. Or was it? Well, no. That statement is wrong, and it is wrong on several levels. Let's get into how that is wrong and how it is actually historically correct to include a fair few women into your medieval-inspired fantasy. So let's get into that statement from before. A woman's role is to get married off and take care of the household. Yes, women in the nobility and royalty did get married off, often very young, often but not always to older men, and often to very powerful men. It was the way that you secured alliances in medieval Europe, where everything was very family-centric. If you weren't related to someone who had made you a promise, you couldn't be entirely certain that they were going to keep that promise, especially if it was about something big, like, political power or military support and things like that. You needed to be related to them, and the easiest way to do that, if you weren't already related to them, was to marry your daughter or your son off to them. Or to someone else in the family if the person you were making promises to or taking promises from is already married. So what about the other part of the statement, where a woman's role is to take care of the household? Well, that is actually also true. However, what that entails is often gravely misunderstood. Taking care of a royal or noble household, first of all, obviously, the wife was not the one to cook and clean and things like that. You had servants for that. It was also not to sit around and sew or knit or embroider or whatever else you often see women in fantasy like this do. Taking care of a household like that is actually more akin to being the CEO of a small to medium-large company in our modern day. There were 50 to 200 people in this household. If it was a royal household, it was probably a lot more. And the woman's job was to make sure that they all got paid, made sure that they all had jobs to do, that all of the jobs got done. It was being the boss of the cooks and the maids and the stable boys and whoever else was part of the household, and making sure that they all did their job. And as we know, this is a difficult job. This is a full-time job that not everyone can handle. So a woman who was married to a king or a nobleman did not have time to sit around and knit or whatever else. And she also couldn't be timid, because she was the one giving the orders. And remember that a lot of the household staff would be men, and those men would respect her and they would obey her without question. They would not disobey her or disrespect her just because she was a woman. Their society and their household would not have worked if that was the case. Okay, so that's a difficult job. I think we can all agree on that. But it is still behind the scenes, so women were really only important, inside the households, right? No. Noblemen and royals back in the day had many, many estates to handle, often at opposite ends of the country, not to mention having to go into court every once in a while, and the occasional war. In order to rule all these places and do all these things, they would travel a lot. And while they were away, who would take care of the estate that was their home? Who would make sure that taxes were collected? Who would, handle issues and disputes and things like that? In a lot of fantasy books, we see an advisor, a second-in-command, do that, whereas in medieval Europe, the wife was the second-in-command. When the husband wasn't home, the wife would do all of those things. That would all fall onto her, and not an advisor or a different second-in-command. And remember, this was the norm. This was how things worked. And as such, just like I said with the men of the household that would respect the wife as their boss, the people, both men and women of the estate, of the area that she was ruling in her husband's absence, they would respect her. They would know that she knows what she's doing. So remember that it is not historically correct for men of a lower status to dismiss a noblewoman just because she is a woman. They would know what she is capable of. Okay, so let's accept this then. A woman takes care of the household and she is the stand-in for her husband when he is away. A man would still always be the head of the household, right? I mean, you've learned by now. Of course, this is also not entirely true. I mentioned wars before, and the thing that happens in wars is that people die. And often, if there was a war, I don't know about often actually, but often enough, the head of the household would die in the war, or of sickness, or of something else. When that happened, a son would take over. If there was no son, or if there was no son that was old enough to take over the household, the wife would do it. Or the mother, if there was no wife. Of course, if there was a son who was just not old enough yet, then the wife or the mother would be ruling in his place until he got old enough. But if there was no son at all, the wife would just take over. Or again, the mother. Or anyone else that was available and related to the head of the household, to the deceased nobleman. Because remember, like I said before, medieval Europe was very family-centric. Being related to someone was very important, and if a nobleman died, the lower nobles and his people would rather anyone who was related to him take over than someone who was not. So it would not be a, again, second-in-command advisor or anything like that. It would be his son, it would be his wife, his mother, his daughter, anyone who was related to him. And if that was a woman, again, they would know that she was capable. So, of course, the next question is, why was she so capable? Where did the women learn all of the things that they needed to know to take over after their husbands? Or fathers? Or sons? Or whatever? And the answer is, of course, they grew up around this. Someone who married a nobleman was probably a noblewoman, and she had grown up around power. She had grown up listening to her parents discuss politics and economics and things like that. And even if she hadn't officially been raised to take over, she would still have learned. Again, noble daughters did not learn knitting and embroidery and that kind of thing. They learned how to take care of the household and how to stand in for their husbands to take care of the larger things at the estate or around whatever land their husbands owned. And of course, after she married, it is not at all unlikely that she and her husband would discuss the state of affairs, because, again, when he left, she would need to know what was going on in order to handle everything while he was gone. Now, to be clear, it is probably true that the woman wouldn't officially be part of the court. She wouldn't be sitting at her husband's side while he was making decisions and talking to people and dealing with disputes and things like that, because she would be busy taking care of the household while he was doing that. But she would still know, and everyone would still know, that she knew what she was doing when she got put in that position. So in short, women in medieval Europe did have a lot of power. It was not the default. If there was a man around, he was in charge. But when the man wasn't around, either because he was traveling or because he was dead, the woman would take over and she would do a good job. Now, if you're wondering where I got all of this information from, some of this I've learned because I've studied history quite a bit, but a lot of these specific things I've taken from lectures that I went to a couple of weeks ago with a Swedish historian who has been working with women's history for 20 years or something like that, and written a lot, written 2 books, and he has a podcast, and he's very, very knowledgeable in this area. And where he has gotten the information is, of course, sources from that time, because a lot of the sources from that time is court documents, it's legal documents, and royal decrees, and things like that. And some of them mention that, hey, a woman signed this, and a woman is in charge of this family, and so we know a fair bit about what women did in those times. And there are a lot of examples of women in this time who rose to power after their husbands or their fathers or their sons died, and behaved and was treated just like any other leader would have been. So that's something to keep in mind for all of the fantasy authors out there who want an historically correct fantasy world and still want to include women. It is historically correct. Women were there. They were capable. And the only thing you have to do in order for them to show how capable they are is to kill their husbands. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and give a comment, and don't forget to subscribe if you want more videos like this. I am going to make a video on female warriors as well, because that is also a very, very interesting subject. So thank you for watching. I will see you next time.